So, in terms of ancient civilizations, China is considered one of the four cradles of human civilization, one of the places where we have evidence of the very earliest communities. When we talk about civilization, we really are talking about cities. Where is it that people had sufficient ability in terms of growing crops to maintain themselves in one place? The four cradles of civilization, generally in terms of how they're received, was Mesopotamia, which is literally the land between the rivers, in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Secondly, the area of Egypt, right along the Nile River. The third is the Indus River civilization in India, and now India and Pakistan, since their division is there. And then the fourth one is China, particularly along the Yangtze and Huanghe rivers. Huanghe is the yellow river, as that's usually known in the West. In China, we have evidence of millet agriculture, that is settled agriculture as long ago as 7,000 BC. The earliest writing we have, which is cliff face writing in China, is 6,000 BC. By 5,000 BC, we have a multi-layered, organized agriculture, evidence of buildings of towns, pottery, burial rituals, and again, pottery and burial rituals, as I said before, are frequently two of the major signs of the development of civilization. And a more sophisticated view, even a more sophisticated spirituality, because in burial rituals, including items in tombs, for instance, is a sign of having a defined idea of the afterlife. We have the first written records in China and about China are about 1500 BC, and then by the 6th century BC, we have examples of metallurgy, the developing of combined metals in order to make bronze bells and things of that sort. So a very, very ancient culture. I'll give you a few minutes to memorize this. This, and I've given most of you a handout. If you didn't get one and you want it, I'll give it to you at the end of the talk. This is the only example I've ever seen that gives you all of the dynastic history of China in one page. And so beginning with the Shah Dynasty, which I'll talk about in just a second, all the way through to the last Imperial Dynasty, which was the Ching Dynasty, and then the Declaration of the Republic of China, and then the People's Republic of China, the Communist China. And so we'll talk about that as we go along, but this, as I'm talking about these, you have a reference sheet. You can refer to them and sort of understand the relationship, and then off in the edges are major sort of events that happened along the way. So this is actually a very cool chart if you're at all into history. So I want to start talking about the first three dynasties of China, the earliest dynasties. They are the Shah, the Shang, and the Zhou. Anytime you see ZH in Chinese, it's pronounced like a J, Zhou. And so we have the first one, the Shah Dynasty. We have no archaeological evidence of the Shah Dynasty. The only thing we have are references to it in three of the most ancient Chinese histories as being the very earliest dynasty. According to tradition, the Shah Dynasty was established by a legendary king named Yu the Great. There is some question as to whether the Zhou Dynasty, the third dynasty, actually invented, because that was the period of time in which it's recorded in these ancient chronicles. The Zhou Dynasty, some scholars think, may have invented the Shah Dynasty, and the idea that the Shang Dynasty took over the Shah Dynasty in order to justify them taking over the Shang Dynasty. In other words, sort of present that as the way things happen. But we don't really know that. The records identify that the Shah Dynasty was from 2070 to 1600 BC. It was followed by the first dynasty that we actually have evidence of, and this chart, this map, by the way, the smaller aspect here is the Shah Dynasty. It's hard to see, but right along that line there's a sort of a purple color. That's the Shang Dynasty, and then the larger green is the Zhou Dynasty. But the Shang Dynasty is the first one we have supported by archaeological evidence. They've uncovered 11 royal tombs near the ancient capital city. They have all the artifacts and weapons and all of that. But the most important thing that we have to tell us about the Shang Dynasty are things called oracle bones. These are either tortoise plastrons. A plastron is the lower shell, the belly shell of a tortoise, or ox shoulder blades, the largest bones that they had access to. And apparently, as part of their religious beliefs, they would scratch a question on one of these oracle bones, as they're called. They first discovered these because they found Chinese medicine practitioners were grinding up these ancient bones and shells and using them as sort of magical ingredients in potions and medicines. And when they started checking it out, they realized this is very ancient writing. They now have more than 100,000 examples of these oracle bones, either shells or bones of oxen, and they would scratch a question on there and then heat the bone and until it cracked, the bone or shell, and when it cracked, they would then have a shaman interpret from the cracks the answer to the question. And apparently, from examples we have, if they didn't get the answer they wanted, they would ask the question again, and they would keep it up until they got the answer they wanted. Very much like modern people, you know, we keep looking until we get the answer we want. But we have a lot of examples of this. You can actually see some of the characters on this plastron, this tortoise plastron, and so we've learned a great deal about that since we now have so many of them. We've learned a lot about their politics, their culture, their art, medicine, religion, because people would ask questions about everything. Will the bamboo poultice cure my aching bones? Things of that sort. And so we learned something about the whole range of culture from the Shang Dynasty. We then have the third of the dynasties is the Zhou Dynasty. It actually is the longest lived of all the Chinese dynasties. It lasted over 800 years. And it's critically important because the Zhou Dynasty is the one that introduced a concept which continued throughout Chinese history from that point, called the Mandate of Heaven. People often talk about this like the divine right of kings in Europe, but it's a little bit different. The Mandate of Heaven means that all of heaven, all of the supernatural, all of the divine is in support of a particular person being the emperor or king. There weren't emperors at this point, I'll get to that, but the king, that the mandate of heaven, that all of the spiritual world supported a certain person as being the one in charge. Interestingly, it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy because if anyone rebelled and was successful, then clearly they now had the mandate of heaven. So whoever won was the recipient of the mandate of heaven. This was also, the Zhou Dynasty was the height of bronze making and the introduction of a new Chinese script. So lots of advances happening just even as early as that. One of the very most important of the dynasties is the first Imperial Dynasty. It is the Qin Dynasty. The Qin Shi Huangdi was his name. Qin being the name of the dynasty, Shi Huangdi means the first emperor. There was a period at the end of the Zhou Dynasty called the Warring States period, in which there were 7 different claimants to the title of king. Well, this man, Shi Huangdi, succeeded in conquering the other 6 and uniting them into one. And in doing so, he declared himself the first emperor. And so he took the name Shi Huangdi, which means the first emperor. The expectation was that his son would be the second emperor and then the third emperor, etc. Interestingly, this is one of the most influential, not only the first imperial, but under Shi Huangdi, they standardized currency, weights, and measures. They created a massive new road system that was standardized. Previously, whenever you came to the border between 2 of these different states, the warring states, they would have different widths of cart axles. And so you couldn't even transport from one state to the other conveniently because the ruts in the road were different width. He standardized all of that. He created a model for Chinese bureaucracy that lasted for centuries and centuries after that. He standardized the writing system. He modernized the military, weapons, and transport. Several of the warring states had built short walls, and he combined them into what he called the Long Wall, which is the antecedent to the Great Wall as we know it. Now, the early versions of the Long Wall or the Great Wall were nothing like what you've seen if you've been to the Great Wall. They tended to be rammed earth kinds of things, none of this stone with parapets and the size, but still the earliest versions of this we can attribute to Shi Huangdi. He ruled by the principle of legalism, which is a philosophy that was common in China, again, for many centuries after Shi Huangdi, which basically said, here are the laws, obey them, or the consequences will be quite horrendous for you. And so legalism became a philosophy. It was much more detailed than that, but that was sort of the principle. He was accused in history of having buried scholars who disagreed with him alive and burning books. But now modern scholars believe that probably was made up by his enemies, that he didn't really do that. But he's probably best known for having built a city-sized mortuary, a mausoleum, in which he placed thousands of terracotta soldiers. If you have been to Xi'an, or I'm sure you're aware of them, the Terracotta Soldier Army, this was Shi Huangdi. He was obsessed with eternal life, so he built this massive mausoleum that had full-size warriors that were to serve him in the afterlife, and also chariots and horses and the whole thing. Again, this is the size of a city. I had never been to Xi'an, but Carolyn and I have talked about it. We very much look forward to getting there. Because he was so obsessed with eternal life, he had doctors and sort of magicians who were always trying to find ways to extend his life or give him eternal life. Unfortunately, that led to him dying early because they gave him capsules to try to extend his life that had mercury in them, and it killed him. So he died, I think, in his 40s. And so the interesting thing is, for all of the significance of this dynasty, it is the shortest lived of all of the important dynasties. It only lasted for 15 years. When he died and his son took over, his son was not up to the task, and so it ended quite quickly. But the Qin Dynasty gave the name to modern China. That was the significance of it. Qin became China in modern parlance. And this outline is modern China. This is the extent of the Qin Dynasty, of the various warring states that he drew together. And this is I've called it, this map, or this slide calls it Great Wall. This was the long wall that he created. He took shorter walls that other warring states had prepared as matters of defense, and he connected them together. It's estimated that 300,000 peasants, convicts, and soldiers were assigned to work on this and other public works projects. As I say, he did massive, in the 15 years of the dynasty, he did massive projects. Well, unfortunately, that was a huge financial drain and a high cost in lives. And that's one of the reasons why when he died, he was a very strong personality. His son was not as strong a personality and was not able to hold things together because of the protest from the expense and the loss in human life, even from all of these projects that they did. Following the Qin Dynasty is one of the very most important. A dynasty that lasted just over 400 years is the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was from about 206 BC to 220 AD, and this is considered one of the true golden ages of Chinese history. Even today, the ethnic Chinese refer to themselves as the Han people. Chinese characters are called Han characters because this is seen as, even though it's not the start of the Imperial age, this really was the time in which, a time of economic prosperity, of advances in science and technology and culture, mathematics. They developed the concept of negative numbers during this period of time in Han China. And they developed papermaking, ship design and building. The first ship's steering rudder, was invented at this time. And so the Han period was also responsible for developing the Silk Road Empire that I'll talk about a little bit today, but then I'm going to get into it more because we have one talk about Silk Road empires. The Han Dynasty was the one that began to stretch further and further out. You'll notice that the expansion over here to the west, this area is what eventually got extended to create the Silk Road, which was the world's most important, probably, communication route, trade route, etc., all the way from Rome, the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean, all the way to Han China, and all that happened during this time. But unfortunately for the Han, they had some major conflict at that time with northern nomadic tribes, particularly the Mongol tribes. The Xiongnu, this word up here starts with an X, it's pronounced Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were at first a scattered group of many different tribes. They were related, but they were not united. And as I'll talk about under Silk Road empires, they finally got a leader that united them all. They ended up defeating their primary enemy, which was called the Wei Zi, and driving them to the west Well, they then became the primary enemy of the Han Dynasty. And so the Xiongnu, these nomadic warriors, ended up at one point defeating the Han Dynasty and being forced to be considered equal partners with them, which did not sit well with the very sophisticated Han Dynasty. And so what happened was, in 138 BC, the emperor of the Han Dynasty sent an envoy whose name is Zhang Qian. Zhang Qian traveled from Chang'an, which was the capital of the Han Empire, all the way over past the Palmyra Mountains over to Sogdia, and then he actually made 2 trips, and he was the first one to get beyond the Tarim Basin. There's a large desert here called the Taklamakan Desert that is in a basin, and he was the first one from China to travel there, and he came back with all kinds of stories. He actually got captured. You'll see this little detour. Longcheng was the capital of Xiongnu, the Xiongnu people. He was held there for about 10 years. He married and had children, and then finally ended up one day, I guess they stopped paying attention to him, and he ended up leaving, and he said, I think I'll go back and find out what's happening back in China. And he left and came back. He was the first one to really bring any accurate information about what existed beyond the mountains and beyond the Taklamakan Desert. Because of that, because of his bringing back stories about even what he had heard, he didn't get as far as the Mediterranean, but he had heard stories about this great empire, the Roman Empire, that existed further even to the west. And because of that, the Chinese began to send more expeditions. Zhang Qian today is considered a major hero in China. You will find statues of him throughout the whole country because they really identify him as being the one person who was responsible really for opening up China to the west, and also to developing the trade, which ended up being so very important to China later on. It became known as the Silk Road because silk was one of the primary products that China offered, but it was more than just silk. Horses, technology like paper making, printing, gunpowder, there were massive amounts of religion. This is how Buddhism came to China, was along the Silk Road. So enormous impact in terms of the whole of Asia and even Western Europe. This is what the Silk Road, and again I'll talk about it more later, starting in Chang'an, which was their capital, and going up. This is the Tarim Basin I mentioned with the Taklamakan Desert, and ended up connecting all the way over to Byzantium, which became later Constantinople, and then Istanbul, and all the way to Alexandria, Antioch, Tyre, the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. And from there, traders would take those goods all the way as far as Spain, Rome and Spain. So very important. I'll talk about that specifically when we have the talk on Silk Road empires. We then come to the period after the Han Dynasty, where it broke up into 3 different kingdoms. There was the Wei Kingdom, the Wu Kingdom, and the Shu Han. All 3 of them with a king that claimed to be the legitimate successor to the Han Dynasty. Eventually, the Wu Kingdom conquered the Shu, and then the Ching Dynasty, a new power, comes along and defeats both the Wu and the Wei. This is perhaps the bloodiest period in Chinese history. Many of the stories, novels, and even films about Chinese history will focus on this period. It's kind of like the Old West is to America. And so they always seem to come back to it in terms of telling stories. An idea of how bloody this period was, as there was all this fighting going on, is prior to the Three Kingdoms period, at the end of the Han period, a census identified that there were 16.2 million households and 56.5 million people. After the Three Kingdoms period, another census identified there were 2.5 million households, down from 16 to 2, and from 56.5 million people down to 10.7 million people, which means 80% of the people were killed during this time period. If those census are accurate, but we do know that it was a terribly bloody time. Despite that, there were a lot of technological advances then. They developed principles of hydraulics. The wheeled barrow was invented at that time, and that may seem like a simple thing. But if you've got a huge pile of dirt, you need to move it from there over here. A wheelbarrow is a very valuable tool. And so in terms of construction, it was very important. They developed irrigation at that point in time, and also the first version of a compass, not the magnetic compass, but a way to determine north. As I say, those three dynasties were conquered by the Qing Dynasty that existed for about 140 years. It primarily was on the east and south of modern-day China, reaching all the way down into Southeast Asia, and a little bit up around the Taklamakan Desert, the Tarim Basin. During this period of time, there were a number of things happening during this one dynasty, like there was an invasion from outsiders. It's called the Five Barbarians period. The Qing Dynasty held out against it, but it was very great impact. Also, what's called the 16 Kingdoms period, where various people were declaring themselves they were kings of their own little areas, and that had to be conquered by the Qing. So it was a time of a lot of upheaval and civil war. It was the time when the Chinese invented the stirrup. And again, if you don't think that's important, imagine what it would be like to be a soldier riding a horse into battle and not have stirrups. Try to stay on your horse when you've got a lance in your hand or a sword. Huge thing. Some of the things that we take so much for granted, until they were invented, it was very, very different. There's then the period of the Northern and Southern Kingdoms, from 420 to 589. Again, a continued time of political chaos, but oftentimes in the middle of the chaos in China were the times when the arts, culture, and technology really flourished. It was during this time that Taoism and Mahayana Buddhism really Buddhism really developed in China into the uniquely East Asian version, Mahayana, as opposed to Theravada Buddhism, which is what they had originally in India. Then the Sui Dynasty, very short-lived, only 29 years, but a lot of reforms happened during this time. They developed what's called the equal field system, which meant it was a way to control the raising of crops, distributing the land to people. They standardized coinage, they spread and encouraged Buddhism, the Mahayana Buddhism in China. There was at this point in time, there was a significant, because they radically changed the way they were distributing the fields to grow crops, there was a huge increase in agricultural surplus. As a result of that, there was a huge population growth. The more food is available, the healthier the people are, and the more children they have. And so this was a period of time in which the population almost doubled during this very short period of time. And then also they built the Grand Canal, which connected the north and south, and they were able to transport crops and other goods that way. It was during this period of time that heavy taxation and forced labor on projects like the Grand Canal, similar to what happened with Shi Huangdi's Qing Dynasty, that ended up in a popular revolt where people simply didn't want to pay the high taxes for these projects anymore, and they didn't want to be forced to work on them. Probably second only to the Han Dynasty in terms of its cultural influence was the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 907. And you will notice that much like the Han Dynasty, they spread well into the west, in fact, even beyond the current borders of modern China. They still had these Mongol tribes in the north, the Uyghurs, the Eastern Gurk Turks, the Western Gurk Turks, all of those are Mongol peoples, and so they continue to have a struggle with that. But for all of that, the Tang Dynasty really developed a very cosmopolitan culture. There were a lot of territorial gains. Population grew to about 80 million, which meant that they could field armies in the hundreds of thousands in order to do battle against some of the Mongol tribes and things of that sort, and to control more along the Silk Road. It was during this period of time, more than any other probably, the Tang Dynasty was when the cultural influence really carried over to Korea and to Japan. The Tang Dynasty was the time in which much of the kind of communication with those countries occurred, and we've talked about that. In the 6th and 7th centuries, there was a lot of influence over to Japan, and then it was in the later centuries after that that Japan began to make it their own in terms of the arts, the culture, and even their religion. A lot of technological advances in the Tang Dynasty, including woodblock printing, the development and spread of a number of different kinds of Buddhist sects. Later on, the state would actually decide that Buddhism was a bad influence because the Buddhists were trying to take over control of the government, as they later did in Japan as well, which is what caused them to move the capital from Nara to Kyoto. But then in the 10th century, we end up with what's called the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. As you can tell, this was a period of great conflict, everything breaking apart. and it wasn't very long, just a little over 50 years. But you can almost generally, well, you can't generally say that in China they tended to have a period of unity and real development, followed by a period of disunity and civil war, and then unity and disunity, and it's like a roller coaster ride in Chinese history. But that's all I'm going to say about 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. Then the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty gained control after the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. They, like the Tang Dynasty, there was a vibrant social life, development of artwork, public festivals. Every major city had their own entertainment center. It was during this period of time that they developed the movable type, which was, they had movable type in the 11th century in China, far before they had it in Western Europe. You know, Gutenberg was 1500s, late 1400s, 1500s was when that was being developed. And so we're looking at 4 centuries earlier, they had movable type in China. This is when they had the first paper money, the first standing Chinese Navy, the first known use of gunpowder, and the first magnetic compass. All of these things were developed. So much of the technology that later got transferred to Europe and that the Europeans sort of took credit for, like movable type and things of that sort, actually began in China. And this was one of the great periods of that. During this period of time in the 10th and 11th century, because of expanded rice cultivation, the population doubled again. And so we have twice the population. It was during the end of the Song Dynasty that Kublai Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan, what we often call Genghis Khan. Did I mention, we haven't talked about China, but in the 1950s they developed a new way of transliterating Chinese characters to English characters. In other words, how do you write Chinese in English letters? And that's why a lot of names have changed. And because previously they used a Western system called the Wade-Giles system, and it had a lot of apostrophes and a lot of hyphens, and did not very accurately represent how things needed to be pronounced. In the 1950s, the Chinese themselves developed what's called the Pinyin System, and so that's why Mao Zedong became Mao Zedong. That's why the various other cities changed, and Genghis Khan got changed to Chinggis Khan, which is a much better pronunciation of the original name. Anyway, his sons and grandsons had the largest contiguous empire in the world, which they accomplished in only a generation or so. And in 1271, Kublai Khan, the Great Khan as he was called, the grandson of Chinggis Khan, claimed himself the Emperor of China, and then in 1279, the Song Empire fell to Kublai Khan, and they created the Han Dynasty. Instead of trying to create a different kind of kingdom, Kublai Khan decided he would just have the next dynasty along the same model as the Chinese dynasties that had come before, and he created the Han Dynasty under Mongol rule. I mentioned that under Chinggis Khan, his sons and his grandsons, they had the largest contiguous, meaning altogether in one, empire in history. The only empire, in fact, that's been bigger is the British Empire, but of course it was scattered all over the globe. And after Chinggis Khan's death, they ended up with his sons and grandsons divided it up into 4 major empires. The Golden Horde, the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which was north of the Aral Sea and Caspian Sea up into Russia. The Great Khan, which was Kublai Khan. The Chagatai Khan, one of his sons was Chagatai, and then the Ilkhanate, which another of his sons, Tolui. And so those were the 4 major empires. The largest of them was the Khanate of the Great Khan, which was Kublai Khan in China. And so during this period of time, they tried to conquer Japan. They did succeed in conquering Korea for a while. It was a very different kind of time for East Asia. It was the first time that non-Chinese ruled China. And this is what the Mongol Han Dynasty looked like. After the Han Dynasty, we have the Ming Dynasty, which was the regaining of control of the China by Chinese. The Ming Dynasty has been called one of the greatest eras of orderly government and social stability in history. It lasted 276 years. It was the last imperial dynasty in China to be ruled by Han Chinese. There's only one after this, the Ching Dynasty, and it was ruled by Manchurians, Yurkins. the Ching Dynasty. But during the Ming Dynasty, they had an army of over 1 million. They greatly extended and improved and rebuilt the Great Wall. In fact, this is what people think of when they think of the Great Wall, right? If you've been there, you probably were in a section of the Great Wall not too far from Beijing, and that's what it looked like. Well, this is entirely a creation of the Ming Dynasty. So this was from the 13 to 1600s. Prior to that, it had been rough stones and packed earth and some even log colonnades and things of that sort that would support it. But the Ming came in, and with a level of sophistication probably greater than any empire before them, they built the wall out of stone with regular guardhouses as towers along the way, etc. They had a standing army, as I say, of over 1 million. They had the largest shipyards in the world in Nanjing. It was during the 1400s that they developed the treasure ships, which I will talk about later, which were the size of this ship. The Chinese rather, during the treasure ship period of the Ming Dynasty, were making wooden ships that could sail the world almost exactly as long as this ship, the Star Legend. And so we'll talk about that in a later talk. A growth of trade with Western powers, a lot of new products, a great deal of silver. It was during this period of time they were trading with the West, but they insisted that the West pay for everything with silver. And that they began to do that. That carried over the Ching Dynasty, which helped lead to the fall. The Ming Dynasty actually fell primarily because of meteorological problems. They went through what was called the Little Ice Age, that colder temperatures, a change in the rain patterns, it led to crop failures, floods, epidemics, and so the collapse of the Ming Dynasty was primarily because of a massive change in the weather in China. The end of the Qing Dynasty, the last dynasty, Imperial Dynasty of China, was the Ching Dynasty from 1644 to 1912. It actually ended in 1911, and then 1912 the new Republic of China was declared. But it constituted pretty much everything we think of as modern China. During this period of time, the Chinese were defeated twice by the British in the Opium Wars. They were forced to sign what were called the unequal treaties, which were very much to the disadvantage of China and the advantage of Western powers. Their ports were controlled significantly by foreign powers. They were defeated in the First Sino-Japanese War, and in that they lost Taiwan, they lost control of Korea. In 1900-1901, the Boxer Rebellion broke out. The Chinese government could not quell that rebellion, and so 8 other global powers sent in forces. Many of those forces stayed behind later and took over cities or ports. Ultimately, the inability of the Qing Dynasty officials to defeat the forces that were attacking them from outside or to modernize, to change in a way that would make them competitive in the modern world, led to a rebellion by intellectuals, young military leaders, and students. And the Wuchang Uprising eventually led to the Xinhai Revolution. The last emperor, Puyi, stepped down in 1911, 1912. The Republic of China was declared. And so I've got 1911 on here, it was actually 1912. In 1912, a politician named Sun Yat-sen was made the president of China, but he was fairly soon after that forced to step down by a man named Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was the commander of the army. That always has a lot of influence. He also had been the former prime minister of the Qing Dynasty, so he had a lot of political connections that carried over. So Yuan Shikai forced Sun Yat-sen from power in 1916, earlier than that, and then in 1916 Shikai tried to declare himself the new emperor. And that did not go over very well. They just gotten rid of the last emperor. And so the opposition to him forced him to step down. He died not long after that. And the army that he had tried to develop, which is called the Beiyang Army, the various leaders of different parts of the Beiyang Army ended up trying to declare themselves in charge. And so you had another warring states kind of period where these various military warlords were trying to run things. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen, who had been forced out of the presidency, created a new political party, which he called the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang. He did so in conjunction, in partnership with the Communist Party. So it was both nationalist and communist at that point. In 1927, one of the younger leaders of the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek, was launched what's called a Northern Expedition, where he traveled around China, defeating those various army warlords, bringing them all into line, and therefore formally declaring that they were unified under the Nationalist Party as the primary leadership party of China. Then, because Chiang Kai-shek did not agree with or like the communists, he thought they were a bad influence, he cut ties with the communists in 1928 and actually began to prosecute the Chinese, to attack them, and that began the Civil War in 1930 between the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, whom he had thrown out of the Nationalist Party under Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was not a primary leader earlier, but we'll talk about that a little bit. The Civil War started in 1930. In 1937, Japan declared war on China, and the communists and the nationalists declared a ceasefire against one another in order to have a united front against the Japanese, although, as I said before, and I'll talk about some this afternoon, the communists sort of laid back for the most part and let the nationalist armies take the brunt of the war against the Japanese. And then later, after the war ended in 1945, the Civil War started again, slowly, because they had kind of held they had reserved their strength. The Communist Party of China began to win more and more control over the country, and to be quite honest, the nationalists did not do a good job of relating with common people, and the communists did, and so they had the communists had much more sort of grassroots support around the country. In 1949, the chairman, Mao Zedong, of the Communist Party declares the existence of the People's Republic of China. The nationalists had been successfully defeated. On December 8th of 1949, the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek, and 7 million of his followers left mainland China to Taiwan to declare it the new Republic of China. And then between 1958 and 1962, Mao Zedong, in an effort to try to do what previous governments of China had not been successful at, and that is modernize China, he declared a program that lasted for 4 years called the Great Leap Forward, in which he did several things. One, he collectivized all of the farms and ended up executing many of the landowners and giving the farms out to small farmers. He also took farmers and forced them to get involved in industry, like making steel. Well, they did not know what they were doing, which meant several things happened. The production of the collectivized farms dropped precipitously from what it had been before, and all of the products that China had previously been trading for cash benefit in order to buy products around the world were so bad that nobody would buy them anymore, because they literally had farmers who did not know how to run manufacturing who had been put in charge of manufacturing. And during that 4-year period of time, 45 million people died in China, either directly because of executions, because of starvation, or even disease. I mean, all the things that come along with starvation and famine. At that point, Mao Zedong lost influence, and it took him 4 years of working very hard to try to gain more influence back. He blamed the failure of the Great Leap Forward on the Western influence, that there was too much pre-Communist Party influence, too much historical influence and Western influence. And so finally, in 1966, he was successful in launching the Cultural Revolution, which was an attempt to get rid of all pre-Communist Party influence, both physically. I mean, they destroyed a huge quantity of artifacts, historical artifacts, as well as any books, any influence that they felt that Mao had convinced them would be wrong. Later on, the leaders of the Cultural Revolution after Mao's death were actually tried for the result of that, which again was huge loss of life and the loss of many of the most important artifacts that China had historically. The Taiwanese, the Republic of China on Taiwan, if you go to the palace in Taipei now, the Grand Palace, there's a museum there that has most of the really important Chinese historical artifacts, because when Chiang Kai-shek and his people left mainland China, they took it with them. And to this day, they'll go, see, if we had not taken this stuff with us, it would have all been destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. So they're very proud of the fact that they retained all of that. So if you want to see the very best artifacts of Chinese history, you need to go to Taipei for that. And then, of course, in 1972, President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger met with Mao and with Zhou Enlai in Beijing and began opening the dialogue between China and the West. And because of a modified kind of economic approach under Deng Xiaoping and others, China has done phenomenally well in recent years financially. This is what we have today. Of course, these are the outlines of China. The island of Taiwan, relatively small down here, is where the Republic of China is. And this is the People's Republic of China, which is a communist government. Any questions about any of that history of China? Okay, 43 minutes, I gave you 4,000 years of history. I figure that's like 100 years a minute. I can't do any better than that. Yes?
Why in 4,000 years does it not appear on any of the maps that China extended south from their current borders?
Right. Why did China not extend south from the current borders in that period of time? There were some times in which it did reach down into Southeast Asia, even parts of Vietnam, etc. But that was never maintained. Again, as they would go through a period, that would be a period of expansion and unity, and then when they would come to a period of disunity, inevitably what would happen is the perimeters they would lose control of, because they'd have to concentrate more on the central part of it. And this is a huge amount of territory. And so there were times they began to reach down into that, but for the most part, and even particularly the Mongols during the Yuan period, they attempted to expand. You know, you will remember that in the 1500s, they twice attacked Japan, and the kamikazes, the divine winds, the typhoons, either destroyed or drove back their ships. And so the answer very simply is there were times they did make that attempt, but various aspects of disunity within China or the rise of other powers, they would always have to withdraw. They couldn't maintain that much land. Yes?
How strong is communism?
How strong is communism in China? Well, depends on who you ask. Because they now have a modified version of communism, they actually talk about it as the socialism with a Chinese flavor. I mean, there's actually a technical term that means that. Because they have introduced aspects of private ownership, and they've encouraged business people to expand their businesses so that you now have Chinese billionaires. In terms of control of the country, communism is very solid. I mean, we just saw sort of a reflection of that in terms of the president of China just declared himself president for life. That's never a good sign, because the ability to change senior management in a government is usually a very healthy thing. That you have the ability to vote people out if they're not doing it. So that's not a good sign. But the very fact that he was able to do that tells you that the control of the Communist Party is still quite solid. But they have made the strategic decision that communism was going to adapt itself to the economic needs of a modern world. And so that's why you have private enterprise and an aspect of capitalism. You know, this capitalism with a Chinese flavor. Is what they have now, which seems to be working for them. If you've ever been to Shanghai, it's quite extraordinary what that city's like. Yes?
How powerful is the central government? How powerful is the central government compared to the regional and city governments outside of Beijing?
How powerful is the central government versus the regional or area governments? There is considerable authority given to anything that works in China. An example of that is Hong Kong. Hong Kong had been given to the British after the Opium Wars, and also Kowloon, the mainland part just across from Hong Kong. And because of the fact that Hong Kong had been so successful, I mean, it is a major center for capitalism and for wealth and business. When China took it over again, they did not force Hong Kong to become like the rest of China. It's technically called the the Hong Kong Self-Administered Region, the HKSAR, because again, Chinese leadership is smart enough to know that's working, let's not mess with it. And so I think that there are other aspects, cities like Shanghai, where they will have considerably more independence as long as things are working well. The central government is still, the center of power, and they have the ability and the authority to be able to step in and do whatever they want, like name themselves president for life. But they're wise enough. I think their economic growth has been that in recent years, China's leadership has recognized that there may be better ways to do this than the ways that were first proposed by Mao Zedong. And I think that from events like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, they realized that being too hardline about this stuff is self-destructive. And so they do give independence to things that are working. Yes?
What about the kind of eastern expansionism of China right now, with man-made islands and so forth, Pacific?
Yeah, the expansion of China into the South China Sea is a big area of conflict and concern. Who controls those waters? And the control of sea lanes is still one of the most important things in terms of economic prosperity for any nation. One of the reasons the United States has been so prosperous over the centuries, recent centuries, has been because we're one of the few world powers that have access to both of the large oceans, Atlantic and Pacific, and so we can trade in both directions. Very few have that. But in the case of China, I think the issue isn't that they're building islands in the South China Sea and claiming it that's theirs. The issue isn't really that we have more land property now than we did before, but rather, if they have property that's there that they can claim as theirs, then they have an area of control that is inherent. International law says that you control the sea lanes within a certain distance of the shores of your land. And so by building islands, they're increasing the area they have a claim to control of the sea, and therefore can control the sea lanes. The same reason why almost all estimates are that the United States will continue to be the primary world power for the next 100 years or so, at least, is because the United States has the most powerful blue water navy, which means ultimately the ability to control most of the international trade. The vast majority of trade happens by ship. Food goods and everything else. Airplanes just simply can't carry enough. And so the shipping lanes are critically important, and I think that's why the South China Sea has become an area of real conflict and concern. Because previously it was open, and now China's claiming we have land there now, and so we control it. And that's a problem. Other questions? Anyone? Well, this afternoon we will dig a little deeper on the issue of the conflict between the Communist Party of China and the Nationalist Party of China in the Civil War when we talk about China versus China. So we'll see you this afternoon. Thanks very much. Have a good day.